Hello everyone, welcome to the latest in my video series about Duelyst, produced in partnership with Counterplay Games. Today I want to talk a little bit about the new expansion, Denizens of Shim'zar. First of all, I just want to talk about how I'm very excited that there is going to be a big new injection of cards into Duelyst. Obviously, Duelyst has regular new cards coming in each sort of monthly patch with those updates, and while that's cool and there's definitely lots of cards that have impacted the metagame, there's nothing quite like sort of the infusion of a big set of cards to really shake up the metagame and really get the sort of creative juices going for players in any collectible game. So super excited for this to happen and really looking forward to what the world of Duelyst looks like with the new set. So for a little glimpse into what that world might look like, I want to go ahead and take a look at some of the cards that have been revealed so far. So let's first start off with the neutral cards. We're going to start off with Yun, the battle pet. So kind of a vanilla card here, what it looks like on the surface, but the fact that it's a battle pet is interesting. This is a new type of card introduced in Denizens of Shim'zar that Counterplay's actually been kind of cagey about explaining exactly how they work. They are minions that are not under your control, from my understanding. They move and battle in an automated fashion. So basically your opponent can play around what they might expect them to do once they sort of learn the behaviors of these battle pets. So we see here Yun is a 5/4 for 3, but a 5/4 for 3 that you can't directly control the actions of is a lot less valuable than just a 5/4 for 3, which would just be a hugely overstated minion. So interesting to see this kind of new twist on one of the things you can do sort of in the digital space in a card game, and specifically in a card game that has the positional relationships and their relevance like Duelyst, because the behavior of that card, your opponent can very much take advantage of it by positioning their minions in an unusual way, or moving or playing cards or whatever else that can take advantage of the AI control over these things. So definitely really interested to see how these play out, and interested to see if the cost of not being able to make all your decisions is worth the bonus and stats that you get from a card like this. So really interesting stuff. Next up we have Zor. This is another battle pet, kind of similar in terms of the space. How good is this? Zor's effectiveness, I think, is a little less conditional on the specifics of the AI behavior to Yun, because most of the value you're getting from this is that it's a 2-cost minion that has Dying Wish put a random mech minion into your action bar. One thing that's probably worth noting on this card, because the battle pets behave on their own, this doesn't really count toward your 2-drops in your deck in the same way. A lot of the role of 2-drop minions in decks in Duelyst is in order to control early mana spring tiles, and you can't really rely on a battle pet to control mana spring tiles in the early game if you aren't actually able to control the way that it moves. So definitely be interesting to see how this behaves and whether this is something that can sort of fill that role, if the sort of AI mechanisms are such that that maybe you can have a little bit more control over it than at least sort of initially seems like you will from what the devs have said. So this could potentially fit into some sort of mech strategy. Obviously, anything that can have an impact on the game and in the early turns and also potentially get you closer to Mechazor could be good in that kind of strategy, but hard to say without having better understanding of how the battle pet mechanic works. Next up we have Soboro, or Soboro. I'm not really entirely sure how this is supposed to be pronounced. This is a 2/4 for 3. Not super exciting stats, but whenever it damages a neutral minion, destroy that minion. First of all, I hope that there's sort of better indications once the expansion is released of minions that have a faction versus minions that don't, and I hope that it won't be something that is undiscernible to the colorblind eye, as I'm colorblind, and many games have sort of core game elements that are actually important for players to be able to recognize that I can often have trouble with. So interface issues aside, this is actually a pretty powerful card because there's a lot of very strong neutral minions that get a lot of play. Everything from Primus Fist to Healing Mystic. Sometimes you see, Emerald Rejuvenators, not quite as much. But this card is particularly strong against the Kara decks that have been cropping up and have been very popular recently, because they generally revolve primarily around neutral minions, and having a 3-drop that can kill any of your 3 health minions and live to tell the tale, or just kill anything no matter how big it is as long as it's neutral, is a pretty powerful effect. So it'll be interesting to see how the metagame shapes itself, and if this card becomes popular, and if this card can be a reaction to a deck like the Kara decks that exist right now, full of neutral minions, rising in popularity. Right, next up we have Golden Mantala. This is another battle pet related card. Again, kind of a difficult card to evaluate without more information, both about the pool of battle pets that are available, because obviously what you can get from this opening gambit is quite relevant, as well as how effective any of the given battle pets will be based on how their AI controls really do work. So hard to say, really. It's interesting, though, that there's this kind of a frog minion. I don't know, it's kind of cool. My guess is that this isn't going to be a particularly effective card in most decks unless there's ways to leverage the battle pets in a special way. Simply because a 3-cost minion that can be killed by a 2-cost minion, because it has 2 health, or just by a general attack, really needs to be something special in order for it to be effective. So my initial gut instinct is that Golden Mantala probably won't be a particularly strong card unless there's a lot going on to really want people to play a large number of battle pets. Beastmaster, this is not a super exciting card to me. 2/5 with Frenzy and Celerity. Frenzy is a powerful ability, but Frenzy is a lot more powerful when your opponent doesn't see it coming, which makes it great on, obviously, Manticore Warbeast, because the Frenzy and Rush combination is great, or on something that can potentially buff something like a Dire Tide Frenzy. A little less effective both when it is on an expensive minion, like this one, but Celerity does make it something that can potentially get into combat in a way that your opponent isn't necessarily as easily able to get around, because it can move twice and then attack. But most likely, I don't really see this card really finding a home, just because its stats and combination of abilities don't really stand out unless you're able to really take advantage of them. Obviously, if you're able to buff this Beastmaster up a significant amount, you can take advantage of both multiple Frenzy hits and the Celerity ability, and that's huge. So by itself, this card doesn't seem like something that I'd be interested in, but if in a deck that can potentially give it significant boosts, maybe you can find a home. Inquisitor Kron, this is probably my favorite of the neutral cards. Definitely my favorite of the neutral cards we've seen so far. It's kind of like a mini Pandora in that it's a minion that's guaranteed to generate value. Immediately when you play it, you're going to get the Inquisitor Kron. You can replace and get yourself a prisoner. Very, very similar to Pandora giving you a wolf with a random ability as well. A little bit smaller, both in terms of the body of Inquisitor Kron, as well as the prisoners compared to the wolves. But the fact that it's an individual card that generates multiple threats, and if your opponent doesn't deal with it, it just continues to generate threats, that's a very big deal. This also happens to combo well with things that allow you to replace multiple times. Any other things that may trigger off replacing, you can obviously have synergies there as well. But the key to this is that it's a totally reasonably statted minion. 4/6 provoke for 5 is a little under the curve overall, but not terrible. It's a little bit more expensive than a Primus Shieldmaster and a little bit stronger, but with this huge upside in terms of the fact that it generates these additional bodies. So this is a card that I think is a big standout to me so far, and really excited to build decks with it in terms of trying to take advantage of that value generation and inability for the opponent to just kill one thing and get away with it. All right, next up, I want to talk about Abyssian. Of course, we can't really talk about Abyssian without talking about the change to Shadow Creep. This is a change that I'm a big fan of, the Shadow Creep effect going from scaling with the number of Shadow Creep tiles you control to just being a flat 1 damage for any minions on a Shadow Creep tile. Previously, Shadow Creep, basically as a mechanic, was Shadow Nova. That it was, you would build up to Shadow Nova, kill all your things, kill you, and it was kind of a really unfun sort of non-interactive particular experience because it was so much of the game was about anything else, but then it suddenly was just about nothing but Shadow Creep coming off of a Shadow Nova, and that's just wasn't super interesting. And I'm really glad that Counterplay made the decision to revisit the Shadow Creep mechanic and just change it to 1 damage on each tile. That allows a lot more interesting designs related to Shadow Creep to be created, rather than everything being about just the 1 card Shadow Nova. So some of those cards, of course, Night Fiend with a 5-cost 3/3 opening gambit, deal 2 damage to each enemy on or near a friendly Shadow Creep. Now this is an interesting card, kind of like a Naga, the Frostfire Naga, being able to sort of just incrementally deal damage to a bunch of opposing things. If you're able to get a lot of Shadow Creep around, whether through Shadow Nova, which now is only cost 4, or through just other cards that generate it, you can get a lot of incremental damage on your opposing minions and really make the board a hostile space for your opponent to be, trying to actually maneuver on, rather than it simply being, death trap if you happen to stand on a Nova. So making not only the creep squares themselves dangerous, but also being around them through cards like Night Fiend makes there a lot more strategic and tactical implications to the positioning of the Nova. So I don't know how good this card will be, but I like the design that goes forward with this kind of card, simply because it makes people think about the mechanic in a different way. All right, well, there is Sphere of Darkness for things that can make Shadow Creep, and this is, a card that really couldn't exist before. Just a 1-cost spell that makes a Shadow Creep, and you draw a card. Previously, in the version of Shadow Creep where it's stacked, this would be way too powerful in effect, and you couldn't make this kind of card. But now, the fact that you can just sort of incrementally, here, put a Shadow Creep here, put a Shadow Creep there, it makes it so that this is something that's kind of spreading across the board, and your opponent has to maneuver around rather than simply being something that blows them up. So definitely like this card. I think it'll be sort of a core card in any kind of deck that's built around Shadow Creep, and really like the change to the mechanic that makes a card like this possible. Similarly, I really like Obliterate. Now this is some big dramatic way that you can actually have Shadow Creep matter if you're able to just sort of spread it around. Instead of I make some creeps and immediately kill you with Shadow Nova, now there's a big finisher that you're building up to in Obliterate. And this is obviously just a super cool card for any kind of deck that's built around Shadow Creep. And one thing that Duelyst has kind of lacked for a while are really big, dramatic, swingy late-game cards. So much of the game is sort of the individual tactical maneuverings going on. And, while that's cool, having there be these game-ending, game-swinging styles of cards like Obliterate, and particularly cards that you have to build up to, aren't just like, okay, kill everything. It's like, no, if you have to have already gotten to the point where you're building up a bunch of Shadow Creeps and then you use Obliterate to take advantage of those Shadow Creeps, that's cool, that's dramatic, and it goes forward with a particular kind of strategy. So I'm really interested to see how this card and the Shadow Creep mechanic, as it's been re-envisioned, does play out. And speaking of big dramatic things, Arcane Devour, this is a card that can make some really, really big late game plays. Essentially, this allows you to play this alongside another big minion late in the game. Obviously, this kind of goes into the big Abyssian style of deck. You can play this alongside like a Reaver, Revenant, whatever, some sort of giant monster that you can play, and not only have the one big threat that you play on the turn, but with this as well. And obviously playing things like Darkfire Sacrifice to power this out to make even more explosive turns even earlier in the game can be really, really powerful in the right situation with the right combination of other minions. So I don't know that it's necessarily worth it, getting the 8/4 body out alongside another big minion when you could just play the other big minion and potentially play just more big minions in your decks. But if there's a need for having sort of additional explosiveness to present multiple threats in a turn, I could definitely see the Arcane Devourer seeing some play. All right, next up we have Lionar. There's some cool cards in Lionar. There is a battle pet that we've seen, Fizz. It's a 3/3 for 2 with Opening Gambit, restore 2 health to a minion or general. Kind of like a slightly powered up Healing Mystic. And this is another card that's hard to evaluate because in the battle pet family, exactly how the battle pets do operate is difficult to know right now without having actually seen them in play. But anything that is better than Healing Mystic in some capacity feels like it's a card that I want to keep my eye on, because that is one of the best cards in the game, and if this is a card that can potentially supplement that, in particular in Xeron builds that can key off of healing effects, having access to more cheap healing effects, in particular attached to efficient bodies, can be very powerful to trigger all of your various synergies. So while difficult to say how good the card will be, definitely a card to keep an eye on. And another card that, again, I kind of feel like a broken record regarding the battle pets because they are just kind of this unknown space. But Fighting Spirit, giving each of your minions +1 health and putting a random battle pet into your action bar. This is kind of interesting because you're getting the +1 health part, and that can potentially in its own right be a relatively valuable effect. But it is obviously associated as well with the battle pet. So hard to evaluate because we don't know what all the battle pets are, how they work. But if there are battle pet focused decks, this can definitely be a solid inclusion in them because you get a bonus effect in addition to some sort of card economy attached to it. Ironcliff Heart. This is a very amusing effect to me, transforming a friendly minion into an Ironcliff Guardian. This is potentially a powerful effect because Ironcliff Guardian is one of the strongest cards available for Lionar. And having access to not only more copies of them effectively, but ways to gain value over your already damaged minions can be very strong, and being able to duplicate, having just more of this particularly strong effect. And I think that this, is a card that on its own can be difficult to utilize because you already have to have another minion in order for you to even play this. But if you're able to play a deck that has things that leave behind tokens like Jaxi or things like that, or even just playing a deck that has resilient minions in their own right that you can potentially transform into Ironcliffs after they've already gotten some damage on them, this feels like it might be a powerful card. So it's a little weird because it is, if you draw it late in the game and it's your only card, it can be totally useless. But it's definitely a card that I think that I'm going to experiment with because Ironcliff Guardians are pretty good. Sunforged Lancer. This is a really interesting card. Not only because it is a powerful effect in a healing-focused deck, but it's just a kind of a powerful effect in general. This is a just really good ability, giving your general a default attack bonus. We've seen just how strong the Bloodborne spell is for Vath the Immortal and Magmar, and this can just repeatedly give your general attack boosts whenever anything is getting healed. And there's a lot of reasonable healing in Lionar in general, as well as in some solid neutral cards. Now this triggers, for instance, off of Emerald Rejuvenator, I imagine twice, because it heals both your general and the opposing general. So if you have this in play and play an Emerald Rejuvenator, suddenly you're able to just go, whacking down all sorts of powerful things just with, your general attacks. And being able to use your general's health as a resource more potently also makes healing on your general better. So this is very synergistic with all those sorts of effects. So this is a card that has me pretty excited about potentially revisiting Xeron decks, because this is a really, really strong bonus that I feel can really potentially give those decks the proactive push they need. And speaking of cards that are great in these defensively oriented healing decks, Skye Phalanx is one of my favorite cards that I've seen so far from the set. Probably my favorite card from the set. I would guess that by the end of the reveals, it may still be my favorite card in the set. One of the things that I like so much about cards like Pandora, which was always a fixture of a lot of my Lionar control decks, is the fact that it represents multiple threats in a single card. It's very easy for people to eliminate an individual threat like an Elix Sunblade or even a Grandmaster Zir. If your opponent just dispels your Grandmaster Zir, suddenly you're losing the effect of it entirely and they can just kill you instead. With Skye Phalanx, though, this is a big endgame card that not only gives you multiple things that your opponent has to deal with immediately, but also protects your general. The fact that you're generating 3 provoke minions next to your general is a really huge deal in terms of being able to fight effectively against aggressive decks. And most of the sort of big threats that you can potentially play late in the game don't really do that. Either they're vulnerable to a single dispel, single removal, or they're not defensive, or whatever else. This is a card that actually fits, sort of ticks off all those boxes. It is vulnerable to Plasma Storm, and if we do see a rise in Skye Phalanx decks, I'm certain that we'll see Magmar decks with Plasma Storm to combat them, but against anyone else, this feels like a really powerful ability, and I'm very excited to build decks using it. So now Magmar. Magmar is another faction that has a kind of a core mechanical change alongside the Shadow Creep from Abyssian. Rebirth is being changed so that a minion that is an egg will be reborn at the start of your turn and will effectively have Rush. So rather than getting killed and coming back, sitting as an egg in your turn and then eventually coming back, it's a much more effective ability and makes it far more crucial for your opponent to remove the minion that turns into an egg right away. So makes it a lot more powerful, and also makes it much more attractive to play cards that turn into eggs, so it makes cards like Lava Lance a lot more exciting. So this is deal 2 damage to a minion for 1. If you have an egg, deal 4 damage instead. Now, this is a card that is pretty interesting because it's just a cheap removal effect for Magmar, which they don't really have. The old Mana Burn, when Magmar Control was kind of one of the big decks, was obviously very effective. at removing both small minions and the dispel effect being very good. But this is a removal effect that can help finish off a minion for cheap, and can also, if you have an egg, actually kill something up curve, which is quite powerful. And I like the sort of tactical implications of Lava Lance, because sometimes you'll just want to attack your minion with Rebirth into something to get it turned into an egg to enable the Lava Lance for 4 damage. And your opponent might want to particularly kill your minions that are eggs to ensure that you don't have this as an option available. It is interesting that the change to Rebirth means that you essentially have to effectively suicide a Rebirth minion in order to get the trigger. You will never have just like sort of eggs sitting around unless you've used something like Chrysalis Burst or something like that. So anyway, definitely an interesting, efficient option for Magmar, which they have really not had much access to recently. All right, so Nature's Confluence. Confluence. I never know how to pronounce this word. Regardless, this is a card that's difficult to evaluate without really knowing much more about A, how battle pets work, or B, what all battle pets there are. But 4 copies of anything is pretty interesting to me, because even if this is 5 mana for 4 2/2s, let's say that's the floor of what we can possibly get, the 2/2 with no ability. That's pretty good. You know, this is not like an incredibly powerful thing, but we're talking about the floor of what we can possibly expect. If they're things like Yun or whatever that guy was, the 5/4 for 3, 4 5/4s for 3, or 4 5/4s for 5, frankly, even if they're sort of automated things that just crawl around the board randomly, is a pretty powerful effect. So this is a card that's definitely going to be on my radar when the expansion comes out, because even if it's not immediately obvious how good it is right now, it feels like it has a lot of potential. All right, Songhai cards. This is probably my least played faction in all of Duelyst, but I can respect the Songhai cards, and I can try and see which of these cards A might get me to try and start playing Songhai a little bit more, or B, that I'm scared of seeing my opponents play. So let's start with Katara. This is an interesting card because it's a 1-drop, which is really unusual for Duelyst, at least in terms of cards we tend to see play. The only 1-drop in Duelyst that sees a lot of play is Bloodtear Alchemist. That's because it has an immediate effect when you play it, and the body is at least somewhat relevant. But with Katara, you get a 1/3, which by itself is clearly pretty bad. But Backstab 3 is a pretty big backstab. And if you pair this with Kalios, the Bloodborne spell, and you can potentially set this up to get actual backstabs in, this can be a pretty powerful cheap minion. I'm curious if it's possible to play a deck that actually plays enough of these sort of cheap things with, I think it's Ancestral Divination is the card that you draw a card every time you play a minion from your action bar. And this is obviously a super cheap minion that you could potentially play. And if you play just a bunch of cheap backstab things, and let's get to it, Shadow Waltz, along with Katara's and other cheap backstab cards and Ancestral Divination, I'm curious if you can just sort of burn through your deck really, really quickly and just keep drawing a bunch of cards. So Shadow Waltz, lowering the cost of all the minions with backstab in your action bar by 1 and giving them +1/+1. This is an interesting card in that it is essentially costing you a mana now and a card now for sort of an investment in reduced cost in your hand and more powerful cards in your hand in the future. Obviously, it only works if you have a certain density of backstab minions in your deck. And right now, I don't think, even with Katara, there's quite enough backstab minions to really make sort of a backstab deck. But I'm really curious to see if Denizens of Shim'zar brings enough more that a Shadow Waltz deck might be something that's realistic to try and put together. And I also really like this kind of design just in general because it pushes people toward playing a deck with kind of a theme of what everything is trying to do rather than just necessarily powerful cards that work together synergistically. It's like, yes, obviously that's kind of silly to say, just playing the best cards that work together very well. It's like, well, yes, they should do that. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but giving people other ways to think about that and other reasons to put cards into their deck. And Shadow Waltz feels like it might be a powerful one, and I'm curious to see where it goes. All right, Battle Pando. First of all, I think it's great that there's Battle Pando. I have all of my minions turned into Pandos, and they're so sad and can never really do anything until I, Dire Tide Frenzy them, kill my opponent's blockers, and get my other guys through. But regardless, it's cool to see Battle Pando, and the card seems pretty interesting. Whenever this minion takes damage, deal 1 damage to all enemies. And that's an effect that, obviously, because you can just get this into combat, you can trigger naturally. And that can be a pretty powerful effect. This always effectively trades into a 2/3 and kills that, but it also kills all their other minions that happen to have a little bit of damage on them. This is an excellent card against Abyssian Swarm decks, and potentially also very powerful against range minions, Jaxies, things like that. And also very good against artifacts, because if anyone has an artifact and this attacks anything, you're going to get a charge off of your opponent's artifact from its durability thanks to the trigger. So this is a very interesting card and might potentially try and enable more controlling-oriented Songhai decks, or at least give Songhai decks more ability to actually play in a fashion that controls the board than just burning their opponent's face off. Well, speaking of burning your opponent's face off, Crescent Spear. This is a very cheap artifact. It's just 1 cost for +1 attack, and spells you cast deal +1 damage. This obviously works very well in a deck with Phoenix Fires, Lantern Fox, particularly powerful with stuff like Ghost Lightning that scales across multiple targets. But obviously the fact that it also gives +1 attack to your general is quite strong too, because you can actually use this to kill a minion and use a spell to kill something else with the bonus damage. So it's interesting to see how this will scale with the various spells that do exist, and if this does encourage people to play more unusual cards like Ghost Lightning and whatnot. All right, Vanar. Let's go through these Vanar cards. We have Huldara, which is an interesting card. It's a 5-cost 3/4 with give a friendly Vesper minion celerity. This is kind of a weird effect. Vesper is a creature type in Vanar that kind of feels muddled to me. There's only a few things that really care about Vesper minions, and it's not necessarily clear everything that is a Vesper minion as far as like what makes them Vesper. But there's Snow Chaser is in there, and I know Snow Chaser is super cool, so thumbs up, or at least Snow Chaser emote to that. But giving a Vesper minion celerity works very well with Arctic Displacer, which is obviously a really big Vesper minion that you can smash people with twice and probably just kill them from almost whatever life total they're at, especially if you're buffing them with something like Foxfire. But this is a card that it's hard for me to imagine this being something that fits into a deck, simply because there needs to be more Vesper stuff going on and more incentives to be playing big Vesper minions that don't really feel like they're quite there yet. So maybe there'll be more Vesper support for the tribe in Denizens of Shim'zar, but right now I'm not really seeing this card seeing play. Lightning Blitz. This is a really interesting card. Give all friendly minions +1/+1 and randomly teleport them to your opponent's starting side of the battlefield. So basically, if your opponent runs away from you and they're all over back on their side, it's like, get them! And this is even just like give your friendly minions +1/+1 and teleport them somewhere on the side of the board. Reasonable effect. If you are running, you're at your side and your opponent runs away to their side, this can be a powerful card to get your minions back over there and finish them off. It can also just be a kind of Spirit of the Wild effect to buff your guys and kill your opponent when your minions are maybe just slightly out of range from them or even near them, but just need a little bit of extra juice to finish them off. So it's a card that's going to need a little bit of play in order to evaluate, but a pretty cool card at least that I'm excited to see what comes out of it. All right, so Snow Rippler. This is a combination of a couple of things that I find difficult to evaluate. Vesper and Battle Pets. So it also just has an Infiltrate ability. So everything is kind of going on in this particular card. Every Vanar thing along with Battle Pets. But the stats on this are pretty good. 3/4 for 3 is totally reasonable. And it could potentially be something that you can add to your decks that use Cryo, that can give you an extra minion, extra body that can be in there that is a reasonably statted Vesper minion. Right now, I think there's rarely something you can actually get that costs 3. There's Glacier Elemental, but that's not really a combat statted minion. But anyway, there's a number of ways that this could potentially find itself fitting into a deck. In no way does it feel like it's going to be a tremendous standout in any of them, except for maybe an Infiltrate Battle Pet deck. But we'll see if one of those exists. Who knows? White Asp. This is a powerful artifact in a line of expensive, powerful artifacts we've seen, none of which have tended to be particularly exciting. Your general gets +3 attack whenever it destroys a minion, summons a 3/3 Blazing Spine Wall. So it's a powerful effect, powerful combination of effects. +3 attack allows you to kill a lot of things. 5 health includes everything from Earthsister Tegete to Veteran Silithar, though killing Earthsister Tegete is probably going to be awkward. But killing a veteran Silithar will mean that your Blazing Spine overwrites the egg, I believe. So even better. But you're paying a lot for that Blazing Spine effect, and Blazing Spines by themselves don't feel like they're really worth as much as you're paying in order to be able to play this over something like Snow Chaser. If you play a Snow Chaser, you can kill things for the same amount of power for one less mana, and that is much better for curve purposes. So you really have to want the Blazing Spines here, and maybe there's some powerful wall-related decks from some of the cards we'll see in a moment, but right now it feels like this is a little bit overcosted for what you're getting. Well, speaking of wall decks, Winter's Wake give all friendly wall minions +4/+4, and they can now move. Every game that I've played with wall, basically, there's just a bunch of walls that are just kind of hanging out everywhere and rarely having an impact if people move away from them. And this is kind of a cool way to make those walls feel relevant again. The wall mechanic in Vanar is kind of one of its muddled feelings. A lot of the mechanics in Vanar to me feel a little bit muddled. There's just a little bit here, a little bit there, not all of which necessarily work tremendously well together. But Winter's Wake kind of gives the wall decks a sort of big finisher that feels like they want. You can be cornering your opponent and cutting them off, but none of that really feels like it's that cool. But if you're actually able to turn those walls into killing machines with Winter's Wake, it feels like it can suddenly be really cool and end the game really fast, because that's a lot of big walls. So this is a card that I definitely want to try out as a big finisher in Vanar Control, and we'll see how it goes. All right, Vitruvian. We'll start with Wind Slicer. This card seems great. One of the things that Vitruvian hasn't really had are good early 2-drops, good early minions that fit into all the sort of styles of decks they want to play. And, well, this is a great card for structure decks. You can potentially play this and get multiple structures in your hand discounted and get a really efficient building going in your following turn. Guy kind of feels like he should have some sort of builder name, not Wind Slicer. He's this dude with swords, as opposed to someone who's like, all right, I'm great at building structures. But the flavor of it not necessarily the most important thing. But I definitely think that the structure element of Vitruvian is the part that hasn't really gotten all that much attention, at least recently. We see lots of decks that use the various Scion's Wishes, which in their various forms they've had over time have all been really powerful. But the obelisks and such have kind of felt like they've gone overlooked. It'll be interesting to see if Wind Slicer enables obelisk desks. I keep saying desks. We'll see if it enables obelisk decks to find a place in the metagame. All right, Whisper of the Sands. Speaking of cards that are good in obelisk decks, say that 5 times fast. Obelisk decks. No. Obelisk decks. Dear God, so hard to say. Anyway, Whisper of the Sands is a really powerful card if you can set up a bunch of obelisks to just rain down dervishes on your opponent. And the fact that it draws a card not only makes it more powerful because, hey, you're getting this bonus effect and drawing a card, but it also means that it won't just rot in your hand. Obviously, in Duelyst, cards don't really ever just always rot in your hand because of the replace mechanic, but it enables you to play multiple copies of this and not just run the risk of having your obelisks get destroyed and have to replace through these and just draw into another one and have it be useless. So definitely an interesting card, and I like seeing the push toward enabling obelisk decks in the expansion. All right, Pantheron. Costs 0 for a 6-cost 6/6. Costs 0. You've cast all 3 Scion's Wish spells this game. This kind of feels mostly like a cute card. I guess this is like what Scion's Wish for, is 6-cost 6/6s. But it feels like, trying to actually build a deck that's going to use all 3 of the various wishes can be somewhat difficult. Obviously, First Wish, Second Wish are powerful, mostly in aggressive decks. Third Wish can be a little bit harder to utilize, and I think is really sort of the card that would be keeping this from being something that sees play on a regular basis in most decks. I could easily see this being, if it costs 2 less, for instance, for each different Scion's Wish you played, this card would be busted. But the fact that you have to always play Third Wish makes it feel like it's much more difficult to actually support in those aggressive decks, because you don't really have access to the dervishes you want to cast the Third Wish on quite as easily. Obviously, you can use your Bloodborne spell to make a Iron Dervish, but it just ends up kind of rotting your hand situationally in a lot of instances, and so will this. But I like the design. I like going down the sort of space that interacts with specific cards. And I'm excited to see more of this kind of design moving forward. All right, Falcius. This is a pretty cool card. I guess kind of feels like it goes on the Cyanasage side of the Vitruvian faction. Even just by itself, though, giving your general +2 attack, take no damage this turn in combat, kind of like a artifact that comes with a body attached to it. 3/3 for 3. Not amazing stats, but totally serviceable. And I think that this is, pretty solid for just giving your general the ability to attack into slightly bigger things. Even just being able to play this and kill your opponent's 2/3 in the early stages of the game can be pretty effective. And obviously works extremely well if you are using Cyanasage and can set up some big attack on something or maybe a blast on something. So definitely a card that I think will see some amount of play. If nowhere else, then Gauntlet, where it seems like a very strong pick. And last, but certainly not least, another in the line of 8-cost dramatic big spells, Circle of Desiccation. Works very well in those obelisk decks, not desks, that we were talking about before. Destroy all non-structure minions. So I was talking way back when, earlier in my reviews, about how I thought that it was really cool that there were now these sort of big dramatic effects in Duelyst that made it so not necessarily just about all of the sort of small maneuvering that's going on between the individual minions and sort of the tactical battles and such. And I think that this is a super cool card that does help support the structure strategy in Vitruvian. So I'm really curious to see if that's something that will have a resurgence with how much support it seems to be getting in the Denizens of Shim'zar set. So anyway, that is it for the cards that have been revealed so far, at least at the time that I was recording this review. So I'm sure I'm going to have missed some, but I will be back in the future with more thoughts on more Denizens of Shim'zar cards. Let me know what you think of my review, or let me know what your thoughts are on the new cards. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest in my Duelyst video series, produced in partnership with Counterplay Games. Today we're going to be playing a little bit more with my Magmar Vindihorn deck, which is kind of my favorite deck to play right now, at least leading up to the release of the expansion, which I'm super excited about. I'm going to be getting into a little bit more in the future, but for now, let's jump into some more games. Here we go.